The Navigation Acts of 1660 put into act mercantilism. The colonies could only trade with Britain, but it was not heavily enforced and added to salutary neglect. This let the colonies practice independence and live without much British rule. The British and the French fought the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. The British won and took over all of France's land in North America. This war generated a lot of debt, though, and paying off this debt led to colonial discontent. After winning the French and Indian War, the British implemented the Proclamation Line of 1763. They didn't want to be responsible for protecting colonists in Indian Territory and kept them east of the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists were angry that they couldn't move past the line, even though they had fought for this land, and resented the British. The Sugar Act of 1764 was the first of the taxes imposed on the colonies. It taxed sugar and other imported luxury goods, and began the whole taxation without representation idea.
In March of 1765, the Stamp Act was passed, which required colonists to purchase a stamp that had to be placed on any official document. This made the colonists very angry because this taxed goods that they had produced in the colonies. Later that year in May, the Quartering Act was passed by Parliament, which required colonists to house and feed British troops. This made the colonists angry because they had to house soldiers that were enforcing British laws. Then, in March of 1766, Britain declared that they had the right to govern and tax the colonies how they wanted. This was passed because of the repeal of the Stamp Act and showed the colonists that they were being controlled by Britain, which led to anger and revolution. Later that year, from June 15th to July 2nd, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, which were a series of laws that taxed paint, glass, lead, sugar, and tea. It also allowed the writs of assistance, which gave open search warrants to British officials, which allowed them to search all property of the colonists. And lastly, if a colonist broke the law, they were sent to regional courts with British judges. All of this made the colonists very angry, which pushed them towards independence.
The Boston Massacre took place on March 5th of 1770 in New England. This was a time of unrest between the colonists and the British government. The massacre reportedly started when a colonist threw a snowball at British soldiers who were in the street, and they fired back at the group of colonists who were heckling them. In total, 5 people were killed, including Crispus Attucks, an African-American man. This fueled colonial resentment of the presence of the British soldiers even more. The Boston Tea Party was an act of defiance by the colonists in response to the tax on tea imposed by Britain. On December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty dressed up as Native Americans and raided ships in the Boston port that were carrying tea. They dumped over $3 million worth of tea overboard. This symbolized the frustration that many colonists felt over unfair taxes being placed on them. The Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts, were passed by Britain in response to the Boston Tea Party. It was directed mainly at New England and shut down the Boston port, banned town assemblies, reinstated a new Quartering Act, and allowed British officials in the colonies to go on trial back in Britain. These acts infuriated the colonists, specifically the ones living in New England. The First Continental Congress was arranged in 1774 to address the Intolerable Acts. Delegates from all of the colonies except for Georgia were present. Their main goal was not to form a revolution, but to instead put an end to the Intolerable Acts. One of their solutions was boycotting British goods. They also wrote a letter to the king to try and convince him to repeal the acts. Another accomplishment of the meeting was the agreement to meet again in 1 year if nothing had changed.